Welcome. My name is Brendan Gillis. I'm the manager of teaching and learning for the American Historical Association. And this webinar is part of a series called AHA Learn, which puts together online programs that provide a forum for compelling ideas and important conversations in history education. Founded in 1884, the AHA operates under a congressional charter to promote the imperative of historical thinking in public life. This mission encompasses professional standards, scholarship, and teaching. So today's session is very much in line with what the AHA is all about. Today, you're joining us for a program called Teaching the Holocaust Digitally, Challenging Student Assumptions Through Primary Sources. Thank you so much for being here. You're joining me and representatives of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum as they walk us through new materials recently added to Experiencing History, a primary source tool for the college classroom. So a few notes about the panel before we get started. This session will last 1 hour. We are recording the session, so just be mindful of that. And the chat is closed, but if you have questions or comments that you would like to relay to the panelists today, you can submit them using the Q&A feature. So after a presentation from our two presenters, I will moderate a Q&A session, and I will relay questions from the audience to Leah and Luke. So before we begin, I'd like to introduce our presenters. Leah Wolfson is the Director of Academic Programs at the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. She received her PhD in comparative literature with a focus in Jewish studies from Emory University in 2008 and has taught courses at Emory and the College of Charleston. Luke Ryder is a historian in the Museum Experience and Digital Media Office at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, where he creates exhibitions, programming, and educational resources like the one we'll see today. He earned his PhD in East Central European History from McGill University. Now I'll hand it over to Leah and Luke. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brendan, and thank you all for being here on this morning/afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. You'll pardon me while I get everything all set up here in these days of Zoom. We're really delighted to be here, and a huge thank you to the AHA for having us. And without further ado, we're going to go ahead and jump in. So what we're going to be talking about here today is, again, this broader topic of challenging student assumptions through primary sources. And we're going to be doing that through this tool that Brendan just mentioned, which is Experiencing History, Holocaust Sources and Context. So what is Experiencing History? This is a free online educational tool that aims to engage college students with curated primary source materials about the Holocaust. And we take a really broad definition of what that might be. That includes things like diaries, journals, and letters, but it also includes different types of sources like photos, art, film, objects, and more. And the goal here is to really get students as close as possible to having 20 sources spread out across their desk, short of them ever being able to actually have sources sitting there on their desk, and to really give them the tools that they need to be able to interpret the sources. So what we really want to do is move students from consumers of information to active agents in their own learning. We currently feature more than 350 unique primary sources on a variety of topics and themes. And we group those sources into more than 30 collections based on genre and topic. And those collections are held together by a general theme. So you'll see on site, we have 4 kind of larger themes that relate to the Holocaust. The backbone of the site is really Jewish perspectives on the Holocaust. That was the first section that we started with. It reflects the largest and most systematically pursued victim group. We have another section on Americans and the Holocaust that reflects a temporary exhibition the museum has had for some time. Everyday Life really examines the role of everyday people in a variety of ways. And then what we're going to be talking about with you today is a new section of content called Belonging and Exclusion, Reshaping Society Under Nazi Rule. So what does this actually look like? Each collection features a fully scanned and, if necessary, translated primary source that also has an accompanying essay that contextualizes that source, and then an overview essay that explains the general topic. So, for example, what you're looking at here is a last letter thrown from a train car in 1942. It reads in full, "Please put this card into the nearest mailbox. Plonsk, December 16th, 1942. It is morning. We are inside a rail car with the whole family. We left with the last departure. Plonsk has been cleared. Please go to the home of the Barnos on 6 Niska Street and give them our regards." That's it. That's the whole letter. So what does one do with this letter? One of our most avid users, Alice Weinreb, who is an associate professor of history at Loyola University Chicago, has used this in her Western Civilization course. And her comment, I think, is really telling. She says that, in her words, "Seeing this letter, its incomplete address to an unknown person, the cryptic message, frame a conversation about the experience of deportation that would otherwise have been inaccessible to me as a teacher. The issues that this source brings up are so complex that it never would have occurred to me to even discuss them. However, the source confronts the students with these issues so clearly that they initiate really intense conversations on their own," right? And that's the kind of interaction that primary sources can really provide in the classroom, and what we're really looking for experiencing history to do. Which brings us to why we're here today, which is the newest content that we released in December of 2023. We've been hearing from instructors for a long time about how they really wanted the tools to teach about the full spectrum of victims persecuted by the Nazis and their supporters, while also making it really clear to their students that they're not all persecuted in the same way. And we'd also been hearing that instructors wanted students to understand how the Nazi regime sought to create a community that Germans wanted to join, as long as they were the right kind of German. So with those needs in mind, we've produced a new suite of primary source collections on this topic of belonging and exclusion that explores both of these concepts at the same time. So this is a short list of what has already been released that we're going to talk about today. And then we'll also be producing at least 5 new collections over the course of the next 5 years. So with that, we want to dive straight into the material. And I'm going to go ahead and start us off by examining, again, the Nazis' largest, most systematically targeted group, but by no means only victim group, European Jews. So what we see here at once looks kind of immediately familiar in a lot of ways, and yet is not quite. What we're looking at here is the ID card of a young 12-year-old Ruth Kittel, issued by the Berlin police in 1939. And this looks like a pretty straightforward bureaucratic document, right, that marks Kittel as Jewish. We can see the big J. But it's a little more complicated than that. Kittel's father was a Catholic, so she was labeled as a so-called Mischlinge, or mixed race Jew, after the Nuremberg laws of September 1935. But because she also attended a Jewish religious school, she was subject to another clause of the Nuremberg laws that labeled her a quote-unquote full Jew. And as a result of that, she was banned from German public schools. Her access to food and other goods was restricted. And as the Nazis increasingly sought to publicly identify and shame Jews during the late 1930s, Jewish women and girls like Ruth were also forced to take on the name Sarah as their middle names, which is highlighted right here. So through this very bureaucratic document, right, students are really prompted to look at how something like this really very concretely shows the ways in which Jews were excluded from German society in a number of ways, and also how a category that seems very clear also kind of gets muddied in the waters in a lot of really important ways. So Ruth's ID card is a state-issued document that announces who belongs to the Nazis in New Germany and who doesn't. But if we pair it with a photograph like this one, we get a somewhat different perspective about what daily exclusion really looks like. Between 1933 and 1939, Germany saw the passage of hundreds of decrees that targeted Jews. And during that time, many German cities and towns also banned Jewish people from using things like public parks and facilities like swimming pools. So this photograph here, we see a young girl standing outside the entrance to a swimming pool in Fürth, a Bavarian city known for its well-established Jewish community. And up here in the upper left image, we see a sign that reads, "Entrance is forbidden to Jews," right? So this restriction could have been a local ordinance, but it also could have been at the volition of the pool's owner and on the initiative, on their own initiative to independently decide to ban Jews, as was often the case. And if we're really teaching with this photo, we can add yet another layer and we can think about who took this photo and why do we have it, right? So the photographer here captured many different scenes of daily life from Firth in the 1930s and submitted them to the local newspaper. So that's how we have it. Uh, but there just are still lots of questions. Why did they take the photo? What exactly was being published in the newspaper? All of these different things that we can still interrogate based on thinking about this photo and this passport put together. So I'm going to turn it over to Luke, who is going to take us into a different direction for a different kind of photograph that also illustrates this concept of belonging and exclusion. So Luke, can you pick it up for us here?
Sure. Thank you, Leah. Hello, everyone. We're just looking at a photo that shows how the exclusion of so-called outsiders in Nazi Germany was sort of embedded in these routine activities of daily life. And we're also getting a sense of how the boundaries between those who belonged and those who didn't were imposed in different kinds of ways, right? Like a seemingly mundane photo spread in a local newspaper. So that image and this next one I want to talk about gives students the chance, I think, to unpack and analyze Nazi propaganda in ways that might really surprise them. So this image comes from a collection of primary sources that explores how the Nazi regime tried to create a sense of common identity among so-called Aryan Germans by making membership in the national community seem appealing. So what we're looking at is an ad from a 1938 campaign called Strength Through Joy. Now, this was meant to unify so-called Aryan Germans by offering classes, sporting events, and other activities designed to encourage a sense of camaraderie and belonging. What we're seeing here is another image, which is a Strength Through Joy car. And this promotional photo shows how the regime is presenting the Strength Through Joy car as a way for German citizens to travel through the countryside, to connect with the land, the culture, and other Germans, right? The image combines these different elements of the Nazi worldview. So, for example, the idea that German people have a mystical connection to the land and that traditional rural lifestyles were the ideal. But we also see in the image that the regime is interested in exploiting the possibilities created by modern technology. The couple in the photograph are leaning on a new mud-splattered car while wearing traditional clothing, and they're posed as if they're taking like a casual break while driving through the Autobahn. So while we usually think of these kinds of propaganda images as negative or sort of trafficking in anti-Semitic tropes, there are a whole different slate of images which kind of present a positive image of life in Nazi Germany. And I want to talk about one of those next. So this source, like the Strength Through Joy car, projects the idealized image of belonging in Nazi Germany, right? The ideal of belonging in a national community. And what you're looking at is a 1937 propaganda film that's designed to encourage so-called Aryan German women to become healthy young mothers. The film claims that these women had a daily duty to train their bodies because they were the mothers of future generations. So you get these nice shots of beautiful babies, young mothers, and a few kind of strange looking exercises on a beautiful sunny day that seem kind of harmless, right? It's even pleasant. If we didn't know that this was Nazi propaganda, there's really nothing here to tell us. But I think footage like this can help students understand how the regime was trying to make Germans want to be part of this national community, but only if they were able to, offer biologically valuable material, if they're genetically healthy Aryans. And this focus on encouraging supposedly racially suitable Germans to have lots of children is a key theme in this collection we've called Targets of Eugenics. And Leah, I'm going to turn it back to you to talk about another aspect of this eugenics program that raises some interesting questions for students.
Yeah, thank you, Luke. So, one of the things that we really tried to do in several of these collections was to kind of present the belonging and the exclusion together, right? And to really challenge this idea that they're completely separate. On this next slide, what we really start to see here is kind of almost the the underside of those images that Luke just showed us a minute ago, right? So the primary source here is a document that tells the story of Anneliese Koch, who gave birth in May of 1939 at the Ostmark maternity home. You see a photo of that here, which was part of the Nazi program known as the Lebensborn program. So this program recruited pregnant Aryan women so that they could give birth to what were deemed biologically valuable children, like we just saw a moment ago, right? This official letter, though, is actually something quite different. This letter asks health officials to consider Koch for possible forced sterilization due to what is referred to as pregnancy psychosis, which she experienced after giving birth. We don't know for sure exactly what is meant by that term. It might be something that we would today call postpartum depression. But what's really interesting here is that authorities who once classified Koch as quote unquote valuable now deemed her to be biologically inferior, so much so that they decided that she should never be allowed to have children, right? And this really gets at the section's major theme, how a very specific, very exclusive idea of national community was built on the backs of highly intrusive and increasingly violent policies. So, Luke, I'd like to come back to you to talk about another part of this new section that really surfaces the experiences of a group for whom Nazi ideas about race also translated into persecution and violence. So, Luke, back to you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, we're really excited about this particular collection of sources. This is a group of primary sources dealing with the experiences of Roma and Sinti people, whom the Nazi regime targeted not only as a so-called alien race, but also because they were branded as social outsiders. These sources we put together here show how the persecution of Roma and Sinti became increasingly radical and deadly over the course of the Nazi era. However, we are very aware, of course, that this is a complex history and student audiences might come to this particular topic with stereotypes in mind or not knowing anything out at all about Romani peoples. So one goal of this particular collection is to show a wide range of Romani experiences, lifestyles, and responses. So this image you have on your screen is an example of that. This primary source is a photograph taken a few years before the Nazi rise to power of a well-known German Sinti boxer by the name of Johann Rukeli Trollmann. And Trollmann is pictured here with his teammates in 1929. Now, a few years later, after the Nazi regime rises to power, Trollmann is stripped of his boxing title that he had only recently won and was criticized for not fighting like a so-called Aryan. So Trollmann responded incredibly. He's the third from the right, by the way, by defiantly parodying Nazi ideas about race. So in a fight, he bleaches his hair and powders his skin white, and he steps into the ring, kind of plants his feet, and fights in a style that the pro-Nazi pundits in the press had said he was supposed to. Now, despite his fame and celebrity status, his boxing career was cut short when Nazi policies stripped him of the right to box, in fact. And a few years later, in 1942, he was sent to the Neuengamme concentration camp, where 2 years later he was murdered. So turning to this next selection, which is in the same collection of sources on Roma and Sinti experiences, I want to go beyond an individual story. The Trollmann source is a great example of what we can illuminate with an individual kind of life story, and turn to a kind of source which gives us another window into this history of exclusion and persecution through the experience of an entire community. And so on the left of this image, you see about 500 German Sinti people being marched through a town. This is the German town of Asperg by German order police. And this is in May of 1940. And on the right-hand side, you see different clusters of onlookers, presumably non-Romani town residents. Perhaps there are other police there, as well as Nazi officials. And I think that this image illustrates pretty well how the Nazis and their supporters found opportunities to deport groups that they wanted to exclude from this emergent national community. Now, particularly after the outbreak of World War II in 1939, Nazi leaders began to organize the first systematic deportations of Jewish people from Germany, but at the same time, they're also beginning to discuss plans to deport the entire Roma and Sinti population of Germany, which is about 30,000 people at that time. So within months of the war's outbreak, Roma and Sinti in the western regions of Germany are arrested and deported to German-occupied Poland. And you can see that process playing out here. Some of them are sent to ghettos, others are exploited for forced labor, and others are simply dumped into the middle of the Polish countryside without any food or shelter. And many did not survive. In fact, scholars estimate that about as many as 500,000 Roma and Sinti are murdered during the Nazi-led genocide of Romani peoples during World War II. So we've by now seen a few examples of how the experiences of exclusion and belonging among different groups were dictated in part by Nazi ideas about race. But our focus on this attempt to reshape Germany under Nazism also brings into view the experiences of those targeted for what was labeled as deviant or abnormal social behaviors. So several of the sources that we put together in this collection allow students to look at the issues of marginalized sexualities and gender identities under Nazism with, I think, a good deal of nuance and complexity. And this document is a good case in point. This is from our new collection, Sexuality, Gender, and Nazi Persecution, which focuses on the experiences of gay men, lesbian women, trans people, and others. And this police report concerns Fritz Kitzing, who was arrested in 1933 and again in 1936 for allegedly violating laws regulating sex work and for appearing in women's clothing in public. And the source we feature here is Kitzing's arrest record from 1936, claiming that Kitzing is, quote, untruthful and depraved. Now, with a close reading, we also see that the report notes that there is no proof that Kitzing has committed any specific crime. It seems like the police know they should target this person, but they aren't really sure why or how. So nevertheless, it was clear to the police, at least, that Kitzing was an outsider that did not accord with the Nazi vision for society. And thus the recommendation is for Kitzing to be placed in a concentration camp, supposedly as a degenerate, quote, who is dangerous to the public, quote. In fact, Kitzing was sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp outside of Berlin, and in 1937, that's where our paper trail stops. We don't know whether Kitzing survives. I do think that this source is really likely to prompt students to ask, why was Kitzing arrested? Not for breaking the law. That report, this report makes that clear. But I think we can open a discussion about how, reactions to openly displaying a gender expression that was unacceptable in this kind of homogenous and restrictive society can be a meaningful conversation, in the context of belonging and exclusion. So one final source I want to share with you before I turn it back to my colleague, and that is this etching, this lithograph. And I think this particular source really raises an important aspect of this thematic material, which I think some of the other collections do as well. But the point that exclusion from the national community in Germany often rested on long-standing currents in German society. And those same currents often persisted well into the post-war era. So this source in particular, this etching, I think, captures some of that continuity. And what you see here is a print made by a German man named Richard Grüne, who in 1934 was denounced, arrested, and charged with violating paragraph 175. Now, this is the statute of Germany's criminal code that bans sexual relations between men. Now, this particular statute was on the books since the foundation of the German Empire more than 60 years before. But in 1935, Nazi officials actually revised this statute and made it much more severe and easier to apply. So now people like Grüne could be, or pretty much anyone could be prosecuted for as little as a romantic glance or a gesture. And it was really open to interpretation and allowed the police to target people with relative impunity. So after Gruna's arrest, he serves a year in prison, but upon his release, the end of his sentence, he was rearrested by the Gestapo and immediately sent into the German concentration camp system. And this was relatively common practice for men charged with crimes under paragraph 175. Now, Gruna was fairly lucky in that he was able to survive and escape from the Flossenburg camp in 1945. And after the war, he creates this set of prints and publishes them in 1947 that reflect on his experiences in the Nazi camp system. And as you can see from this example, the works have a very emotional, very visceral, and expressive quality. And this particular example suggests the kind of close bonds that could develop between concentration camp prisoners, enduring the hardships together of their incarceration and persecution. What's notable, I think, here is that this particular etching doesn't relay anything about Gruna's identity as a gay man. And this isn't uncommon, actually, because sexual relations between men remained criminalized under different versions of paragraph 175 in both post-war East and West Germany. So many men continued to experience persecution for their sexuality long after the end of Nazi rule. So just to sort of stitch things up here, I think another thing this source really brings home is how much we were committed to featuring a variety of voices and perspectives to complicate the idea of who belongs and who is excluded, at the same time that we wanted to make sure we highlighted the voice of the victims. So I'm gonna turn back to Leah to talk a little bit more about why primary sources animated by victims' voices can be such effective windows into this history.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. So as we kind of close today's discussion and open it up for your comments, I want to go back to what primary sources really do so well, which is take this event that seems long ago and far away at this point and make it really personal. This document that we're seeing here is not actually part of our new section of the material that we've been talking about. This comes from our inaugural section of material, Jewish Perspectives on the Holocaust. It's from the collection that is all about Holocaust diaries. But it brings us back, I think, to this larger point about how primary sources can really challenge student thinking in some really profound ways. So what we're seeing here is a couple of pages from the diary of Irena Hauser, a Jewish woman who was deported from Vienna to the Lodz ghetto together with her husband and her 6-year-old son in 1941. And just to give you a sense of the tone of Hauser's diary, this is a very small couple of sentences from her entry on July 15th, 1942, which was 2 months before Hauser and her son were killed in Chelmno. So she writes, "Today my strength is at an end and must now sacrifice the last to starve off starvation for the child's sake. The child cries from hunger. The father wants his cigarettes. The mother wants to die. Family life in the ghetto." And if our students are used to reading diaries like Anne Frank that appear to project a far more hopeful tone, this is really quite different. And I wanted to share with you some kind of feedback from one of our colleagues, Dr. Robin Judd, Associate Professor of History at Ohio State University, who uses this diary in her History of the Holocaust course for almost exactly that reason, that this really challenges the way that we think about first-person accounts in a lot of ways. And she recently told me the impact that this had on one of her students who was a single parent and who often had to bring her 5-year-old son to class. Robin really talked about how this diary became personal to this student because, in Robin's words, it forced her to surface so many of the issues that she was grappling with at that moment. How does one parent in such an extreme situation? What is the role of the family in different situations and time periods? And she notes, "I still hear from this student about that." And I think at the end of the day, that's really the power of these primary sources. And that is what Experiencing History is aiming to do. It's to encourage students to think about this history in new, sometimes very personal ways that makes it very present and relevant to them. I always say amongst our team, and they're probably sick of hearing me say it, that our biggest win is a student who says, "I never thought about it that way before." So our hope is that we provide as many different points of entry for that statement to be true. So I want to thank you so much for your attention, and I want to thank AHA for inviting us here. And I'm going to stop sharing screen. So, Brendan, I think it's back to you.
Wow. Thank you, Leah and Luke, for a stimulating presentation and for your work in creating these resources that I think are going to be valuable to faculty across the country and around the world. So just a reminder, we'll be accepting questions from the audience. So in Zoom, you have the access to a Q&A toggle at the bottom of the screen. So if you open that up, you can type a question. It will come to me, and I will relay these to Leah and Luke. Just to get things started, and as folks in the audience um, consider questions that they may have for you about how to use these resources. I thought the way in which you closed and referenced how a specific source went over in the context of a classroom was provocative and insightful. And I just wondered if you could share any other examples of how resources like the ones that are part of this larger collection are being applied in the classroom.
Yeah, sure. So, any number of ways. I'll speak a little more generally, and then I'll see if something about a very specific source comes to mind. I'll say one of very early on, pre-COVID, obviously, one of the most innovative uses of the site that I had not taken into account at all was an instructor who actually taught a study abroad course that went to a number of kind of previous sites of genocide and discussed them in different ways. One of the places they went was the former site of the Warsaw Ghetto. And her students looked at the documents in Experiencing History while they were standing in that place, which I thought was a really striking way of using the material. They were on the street that the document mentioned, and that's where they were reading said document. And that's a really different relationship to sources than we usually think about. So that was one thing. And I'll say another thing from a professor of art history who teaches a course on the visual culture of World War II at Hamilton College, wrote that her students were really struck how much they were learning about Jewish life, that they noted that for them, the Holocaust was only about death, right? And I think that's another thing that primary sources really remind you is, these are moments that are lived, and they're lived in really complicated ways, and they're lived by all kinds of different people in many different scenarios. And that really comes to life when you're thinking about individual sources, or even just individual perspectives, right? Since we're sometimes used to seeing kind of giant bureaucratic documents.
Great. So I'm going to forward a question from the audience now. Marissa Natale asks about how to teach with these sources in an online or asynchronous setting, where sometimes it's a little bit more difficult to create opportunities for discussion with students.
Sure. So the hope of Experiencing History is that we give kind of enough scaffolding, and the link I think was dropped in the chat or in the Q&A so that you can really take a look at it yourself. What we didn't want to do was to just so to speak, give you a diary in the translation and leave it at that, right? We wanted to give students kind of just enough of a runway to know who is Irena Hauser and what was the Lodz Ghetto. We try to model good citations. So if you look at some of those pages, you'll see that there are citations to secondary literature. There are also links out to our Holocaust Encyclopedia. So we're really, if you're not having a discussion and if you're looking for kind of one-stop shopping, so to speak, for your students, we're hoping that we're offering you enough about the one source, if that's what you're looking for. That source is also embedded into a larger discussion of what type of source it is or what topic it's on. So that again offers another window if that student wants to go one step beyond. And then there are, of course, links out to other museum resources and other scholarly resources that, again, hopefully get us to that kind of larger aperture. So the goal is for this to be, if needed, its own self-contained universe. And if wanted, a starting point for discussion, right? That there are lots of different ways in depending on which way in you're looking for. One of the things we really aim to do was to try to make that as flexible as possible, recognizing that everyone's classroom is different.
Great. And sort of expanding on this question, Mikala Bush asks, how do you set the context of the primary sources for information that's perhaps previously unknown to students, especially when you're using a digital tool like this?
Absolutely. So we take full advantage of what the web can do for us. And that means that we do a lot of linking out to other museum resources that we think, again, will give us that context. So, for example, in the entry that discusses Irina Hauser's diary, there is a hyperlink to our Holocaust Encyclopedia article on the Lodz Ghetto, because you may not know what the Lodz Ghetto is. And that encyclopedia article gives you a really quick read. It's meant to be a quick read, so that you're not sending a student down a rabbit hole of feeling like something is inaccessible to them. So that's one way in which we do that. Again, we also try to cite those secondary readings. And I'll say one of the things that we're very conscious about in terms of access, and Luke is a key part of that, as is Dr. Mark Alexander, who couldn't be with us today, is to make sure that the way that we're writing these particular primary source explanations or these introductory essays is something that is at a reading level, it is as accessible to as many different students and as many different backgrounds and as many different, as much or as little information as you might have about the Holocaust as possible. So we're really trying to kind of scaffold these conversations as much as we can. Again, because everyone's knowledge level is going to be different. And as instructors, the way that you use these materials is also going to be very different. We looked at the first quote from Alice Weinreb, who teaches a Western civilization course. She spends 2 weeks on the Holocaust, and that's probably 2 weeks longer than a lot of people have the time to spend, just because of her specialization in the way her way in. Robin Judd teaches a whole course on the Holocaust, right? And we want to be just as available to both of those things.
Great. There were several questions which I'm going to sort of lump together, that asked about how you chose which groups to highlight in the categories of belonging and exclusion, because obviously there are lots of different constituencies here. And I think this gets at the larger issue of how you create the architecture for a resource like this. How did you decide which kinds of stories to foreground, which kinds of experiences to emphasize when you were putting together this collection?
Luke, would you like me to start, or do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I can perhaps we can volley back and forth here a bit. And apologies, my Wi-Fi dropped out, of course. So I'm back. Um, so this creating this kind of resource really involves a lot of very careful research, as you might imagine, and it also involves a lot of conversations about how to most comprehensively address the topic at hand. We have 350 sources on site, right? So we're not meant to be a catalog of every experience. However, we're trying to be as as representative and useful as possible for the folks that are out there, teaching these topics with their students. So, we started with these five collections that we've discussed here, and that was with the recognition that there were lots of different experiences, different kinds of sources, even that we weren't going to be able to include in our first go. So what we wanted to do was create an architecture that would allow us to include the experiences of Jehovah's Witnesses, the experiences of trade unionists, the experiences of communists, the experiences of people with disabilities, and there is the very clear intention that we all have to get all of those different experiences within this kind of discussion, and that's why we have 5 years. 4 or 5 years more worth of content to develop. Leah, go ahead if I left something out there.
No, I think, Luke, you did a great job of conceptualizing it. I think, this is a long-term project. We are at the beginning, not the end. One thing that we felt very strongly about as a team is that we wanted to release those 5 collections together as a unit, as a starting point, because we really wanted to look at different types of experiences next to each other, and that was really important to us. Traditionally, we would have released these kind of one at a time over the course of a year and a half, give or take. But this time out, it was very important to us to present those together. And again, also with the recognition that, as Luke indicated, there are many other experiences yet to come. This is absolutely not the end. This is really the beginning-ish.
Great. Gerald Steinacker asked a question about feedback from educators, and was curious to know whether you publish some of that feedback, and because he uses this kind of resource in his big Holocaust class and finds it very useful.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Gerald. It's great to hear from you. We haven't published it as an academic article in and of itself, if that's what you're asking. We have certainly run in the past and will run within the next 2 years, kind of an internal evaluation of how is it that these things are getting used, because we launched the site in, depending on how we're counting, around 2018. And quite a few things have changed since 2018 in the world, as well as in the way that we approach digital sources, as well as in Holocaust historiography. So I would say we've not done that publicly as of yet, but we are hoping to kind of get the word out in more kinds of discussions like the one we're having today.
And have you thought about sharing lesson plans, or are there lesson plans part of the resource?
That's a great question, Brendan. And when we were developing this many years ago, the feedback that we got at the time was that flexibility was really key. And one of the things that we were a little hesitant to do was to, when you put a lesson plan out there, it's very useful to one person and it's not very useful to someone else, right? And we really wanted to offer the kind of flexibility to be able to enter this into any number of ways. Maybe you'll only use one source in your whole class about something very different. That's great. Maybe you'll take an entire collection and you'll do a deep dive. That's great. Maybe you're teaching an entire course on the Holocaust, for which this becomes the basis of a lot of different things. Also great. We will never be able to write lesson plans exhaustively about each of those use cases. So at the time, we were much more hands-off. Whether that is something that we continue to do in the future remains to be seen. I would also point to my colleague Luke is in a part of the museum that produces a lot of lesson plans for the K-12 audience, but I think many of those are quite useful beyond the K-12 audience on a lot of different topics, everything from kind of fundamental events within the Holocaust to more kinds of source-based things, like how do we analyze a photograph, how do we analyze a diary, those kinds of things. Luke, I don't know if you want to add anything about what's available in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, we really did design this tool with the secondary 17 through 30-year-old, as we call them, emerging adult audiences. And I think there was a hesitancy to be too prescriptive about how those students would encounter this kind of subject matter. But I will say that one of the things we tried to do, I think, in this particular presentation for you all and elsewhere when we talk about this resource, is look at how these sources can be placed in conversation with each other. And now that's not a lesson plan, but that is a way to get a real solid sort of foundation in whatever topical area you're in, and then pull out some of the more nuanced and layered issues that might come up in that conversation. That's not a concrete plan to enter the classroom with, but it is an opportunity to build out a way of talking about and orienting your class around a particular topic.
Great. Well, you actually just answered a question from Steve Potts, who asked what ages these sources are best used with, and recognizing that you were very clear these are for college-aged audiences. And I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit more, or perhaps suggest where any K-12 teachers in the audience might get resources and lesson plans to address some similar themes and topics.
So I can start talking, and Luke, perhaps you can send our friends on the back end our one of our pages that goes through that in quite a bit of detail. Steve, obviously, we recognize that educators take from all kinds of different areas, and if this particular resource is useful for the high school classroom, that is a wonderful thing. And we see around 15 or so % of our use base comes from K-12. I would say that as we're designing these types of tools, we're the audience that we are researching on, and the type of research that we're doing is really within the college classroom space. So that's where the topics come from. That's where the approach comes from. So that is more kind of the area that we're looking at here. But the museum has a very robust amount of information and resources for that is very specifically tailored towards the K-12 audience. In fact, there are some really wonderful lesson plans about if you only have one day to teach the entire topic of the Holocaust, which is quite unreasonable in a lot of ways, but is the challenge that many are facing. The page that I think is going to come up for you in a few minutes has that resource for you. If you want a specific exercise related to a timeline, there's that resource for you. So there are a lot of different options for the K-12 classroom that we have available. There's also a really wonderful opportunity called that invites you to ask a question of our education staff if that is something that you would like, if there's something you would like particular guidance on. And I see that our colleague Jake from AHA has just dropped that page into the chat there.
Kathleen Pate has a question about other directions and kinds of sources that you're thinking about exploring. Particularly, she wants to know whether the museum has plans to curate a collection of records related to the post-war handling of restitution and reparations.
That's a great question. We actually just had a faculty seminar on precisely that topic. And as we were looking through, we were experiencing history, we were noticing a relative dearth of material on said topic. I think one of the really wonderful things about a digital resource that is so unlike the book that gets published and put on the shelf is that we really have the opportunity to continually add and to see needs out there in the world and respond to them. And in fact, one of the processes that Luke has headed up, and perhaps he'll say more about this, is a kind of constant content review, right? We review content for all kinds of reasons. We review it to make sure our citations are up to date. We review it in terms of holes that we might find in terms of the type of content that we would like to add. We review it for all kinds of things. And that's something that Luke really heads up with together with our colleague, Mark. Luke, I don't know if you want to say more about that process.
Yeah, I would just add that, an important part of that is hearing from folks in this kind of format. I'm sorry, I didn't catch the name of the person that posed that question, but that is exactly the kind of data point that helps orient us toward closing up a gap like that in our coverage on the site, and along with that, deepening the kind of linkages and connections that are in our existing body of sources to guide people to those topics, to put the most recent secondary literature out there, to find the really useful online databases and other large, whether it's digital humanities projects or something more like an archive, making those things available and interwoven with the source material that we put out there is a way that we can build the web that we've created and sort of pull in topics that we might not address, really directly yet.
Great, thank you. Ruth Adele asks whether these resources have been used in community conversations, so sort of outside of the classroom, but to facilitate, educational experiences.
Ruth, that's a fantastic question. I'm going to be really honest with you. I don't actually know. I don't really have good data on that. What I can see through the kind of data analysis that we do is I can certainly see when our items are kind of cited in popular media, which has happened several times. I think that is actually something that, while not the express intention of the site, is kind of a welcome addition. We certainly hope that our materials are used in places where they need to be cited in a variety of ways. So I've seen it in that way. I've not necessarily seen it as part of a community conversation. Luke, I don't know if that's something that you've seen in other contexts.
No, in fact, I'm not aware of a specific application in that way. Although, there's all kinds of different ways that our materials are invoked in different online communities. And so I mean, it's while our tool is designed for the college classroom, folks from all, the whole spectrum of life are engaging with it. But it's an interesting question. I think, we can drill down on that some more.
So Marilyn Miller thanks you for giving examples of how these materials have been used in different disciplines, and wonders what kind of searchability and filters you have that allow you to access the resources that are available. So is it possible to filter materials based on region to make them more useful for area studies folks?
Yeah, I can address that. And there's a few different ways. That the site itself is of course searchable with a keyword. It's the most common way of kind of filtering out results. And we do have an advanced search with primarily focus on media type and location. But what we also have developed in recent years is a tagging system that allows folks to access our different sources or different collections based on a particular sub-theme, which may not make its way into a search term. So, for example, something like mass violence. You couldn't really search our tool and find something using mass violence, although of course much of the material might pertain to that topic. So I'd invite you to check out the tags that we've created for the site and kind of explore the way that provides different linkages between different sources that might not even be related by geography or particular thematic focus, in the architecture of the tool, but kind of bring them together through another strata.
Great. Kelsey Utney asks about data. Do you have any plans for creating CSV data sets that allow students to apply quantitative skills and thinking, just recognizing how tools in the context of the history of slavery have been useful?
Mm-hmm. Elsie, that's a great idea. At present, we have not, which is not to say that we would not ever. I'd be very curious to learn what kinds of applications you might see in terms of that kind of digital humanities project. There are other projects at the museum that have gone very deep in terms of the projects, approaches like that, and digital humanities approaches like that. We have not to date, but again, the Experiencing History, like all web projects, is a living thing. So that sounds like a very interesting potential project.
Gabriela Fondes points out how valuable the lens of belonging and exclusion is for making these sources accessible. It helps explain one of the biggest questions students have, which is, why did so many people support Nazism and its anti-Semitic and exclusionary policies? So this is a question about sensitivity. So what suggestions do you have about engaging in discussions with Nazism and its view of belonging without undermining the various groups who are excluded here? Because that's a tricky balance.
Do you want to start, Luke? Do you want me to start?
I mean, it's a tricky question. My very unhelpful answer would be very carefully. So I mean, I think that one of the things we often deal with in the work that we do is this idea of comparative victimhood. And I think that what you've rightly picked up on here is a way to into this material without sort of encouraging an Olympics of victimization. And trying to really break out the ways that different groups are persecuted according to a similar matrix of thinking, and in ways that yield different experiences. Um, and as far as talking about belonging, I'm not sure that delving into a conversation about the German national community isn't going to call into question, the great differences in experience between those who are destined or selected for belonging in the community and those who are excluded. But I do think that these materials offer enough complexity about those experiences, and that's the kind of the real value add of our tools, that you really that this isn't a very pat example of these folks over here and these folks over here, but there's a real effort to explain the how and the why that these processes unfold. And I would hope that that kind of contextualization can prevent some of the friction that I think you're gesturing at here. I know that's probably not a very satisfying answer, but maybe Leah has something to add that.
No, I would just say that your question really points at the heart of what we struggled with when we were really thinking about how to pull this together, right? Because we could have done this a very different way, and we picked this way. And when you have a collection like, for example, Targets of Eugenics, that includes very clear examples of Nazi propaganda and also includes a examples that are voices from the victim group that we talk about there, talking about disability, talking about a number of other things. Uh, you know, we put those two things next to each other and they sit in tension, right? And that's part of the idea, is that they sit in tension. And I would even say that in our collection that looks at propaganda and national unity, which is the very kind of propaganda forward, obviously, collection of this new section, our colleague Mark Alexander, who couldn't be here today, was very intentional about picking some of those images that look kind of innocuous, right? It's an ad for a car. And then really kind of peeling the onion back and taking a look at, but sure, it's an ad for a car, but why? And why this image and not something else? And what is this trying to do anyway? And really doing a lot of complicating there, which we have the luxury to do, and that really invites the kind of source analysis that we are hoping will happen. So I think that question really is the tension that we talked about a lot, about what is the right balance between kind of traditional, not between quote unquote Nazi images, perpetrator based images, and victims' voices. And we, very much struggled and talked a lot about what was the right balance, if there can be such a thing, but between those perspectives. Luke, do you want to add?
Well, yeah, I want to add. I mean, I think you've illustrated a couple of different aspects of this, but I also just want to add something that we talked about in our presentation, is this emphasis on highlighting how these sort of positive. I mean, we use the word positive, but underpinning those positive images is a very a worldview that implies a great deal of violence, and prejudice. So when we say positive aspects or feelings, I mean, I think that we're trying to convey something about something that students might not be used to hearing about Nazism, but that doesn't mean that we aren't careful about the language we use to present those types of campaigns, that sort of those ways of thinking, the kind of details of the ideology. They're really carefully described in our materials to try to show students, the full complexity of what that ideology implies.
Well, thank you for a thoughtful answer, and thank you all for attending what I think has been a really stimulating session today with some great questions. I'll just add I realized we didn't have time to get to all the questions in the Q&A. So Dr. Wolfson and Dr. Ryder are both at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. You can find contact information for them on the website, and I'm sure they would welcome any follow-up questions that we didn't get to today. Just a quick word of thanks to Leah and Luke for really fantastic presentation and all of the work that you do to create these resources online. As a reminder, the resources that you saw today are part of the Experiencing History, Holocaust Sources in Context collection at the Holocaust Memorial Museum website. So you can find these and many, many more resources and sources there. And keep an eye out for a recording of today's event in your inbox. And for future events in the AHA Learn series, we have one coming up in March focused on our Mapping the Landscape of Secondary U.S. History Education project. If you're already a member of the AHA, thank you. Your membership supports programming like this. If you're not yet a member, we hope you'll join today to allow us to keep doing things like this. Jake has posted a link to the webpage for membership in the chat. And again, thank you to our presenters. Thank you to all of our attendees for a wonderful session today.
Thank you all.
Thank you.